So welcome to our first video lecture of the year. And we're going to be starting with the main building block. When we talk about comparative politics, we often talk about comparing things, obviously. And oftentimes what we are comparing is countries or comparing states. Not always. We'll talk a little bit more in our methodology section about the fact that we can compare a variety of different units of understanding of or organizations. But oftentimes we talk about comparing different countries and comparing how they approach everything from electoral systems to party systems. And so it's important to kind of start off with a clear understanding what we mean by the state, how did it develop, and what are some of the theories that political scientists have come up with regarding the origins of states. So today what we're going to do is we're going to start with 4 key definitions: the state, sovereignty, a regime, and a government. Some of those basic terms that we probably throw around, we use quite frequently, but maybe don't have a clear understanding of where they came from and what they really are trying to point to. Then we're going to talk about, where does the state get its legitimacy, and to look at particularly 2 different theories of where that legitimacy comes from. One that isn't quite used anymore, and one that kind of is the basis of how we understand legitimacy today. And then we'll talk about 3 different political scientists and how they understood the modern state to come to be, in particular in Europe. So we'll start off with these 4 key terms that I wanted us to take a look at and really understand what we mean when we're referring to each of these terms. The first is the state. So what is a state? So this guy up here, this is Max Weber. He is a German philosopher. He was writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he was really interested in this question of, why states? Why do we organize ourselves into states? That's not necessarily the only way we could do it. We could, for example, have feudalism. We could have private mercenaries that, and private warfare where whoever has the most might and power gets to rule. There's often cases where there are religious courts where the religious law has jurisdiction over some issues. So he's writing in this essay called Politics as a Vocation, and he gives this definition of the state that we tend to use quite frequently. That state is the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence or legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. And so the idea of the state is that the state has this legitimacy. They can then give that to other groups and organizations. They might give it to the military, they might give it to the police, they might give it to individuals in order to defend their own property. But that this power descends from this community that has said, we're going to give this legitimate ability to use force to this organization, and that being the state. So again, we need to realize that monopoly does not necessarily mean that only the government can use force. As we said, they might say within law that it's okay for you to defend your house if you have a burglar coming in, or to defend yourself if somebody is attacking you. You are then using violence, but in this case, because of laws, you've been given that power to do so. And that power really just extends from the state's authority. And so that's kind of how we understand the term the state. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the legitimacy in a few minutes, about where that legitimacy comes from. So we often say then we will talk about state sovereignty, or the idea that that a state has legitimate sovereignty or legitimate control. And the way we understand sovereignty, there's a few different ways that we could understand that. So the first, we might want to talk about domestic sovereignty. So, actual control or actual capacity of a state. So, there are countries around the world where, the legitimate government or the legitimate state really doesn't have the capacity or this ability to use violence or legitimate use of violence within their territory. We can see lots of examples of failed states where that's just not the case, where you can see, like in Syria, for example, maybe a little less so today, but the idea that, there might not actually be the capacity. And then we would say that really there isn't sovereignty then. That state doesn't have sovereignty because it really doesn't have the capacity to exercise the use of violence within their territory. Another way we might conceptualize sovereignty is this idea of international legal sovereignty, so the formal recognition by other states. So oftentimes we'll talk about, is this state recognized by the United Nations, for example, or recognized by their peers, by other states. A good example of that might be Kosovo in 2008. It declared itself independent from Serbia. And over the next few days, many countries came to say, yes, we recognize Kosovo to be a sovereign state, but it's not a UN member. So that it's still working on getting that designation or that recognition of being sovereign. But then when we talk about sovereignty, and if you've taken 116, you've probably covered this. When we talk about sovereignty, we often will be talking most clearly about this idea of Westphalian sovereignty, the idea that each state has domestic authority and that other states aren't going to interfere with that. And that's kind of what defines their sovereignty. So it all goes back to 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia that came out of that. So we're talking mid-1600s, essentially 30 Years' War in a nutshell. It was pretty much a religious war, Catholics and Protestants fighting against each other, and in the end, nobody really had a clear victory. And so what they decided when they set out to kind of create a peace after this 30 years of war was that we're going to have kind of status quo. So every state's going to decide that we're not going to interfere with each other's religious practices. We're not going to interfere with what goes on in each other's borders. We're just going to say, you do what you want in your country and we'll do what we do in ours. And it was very much like a practical accommodation, a way of figuring out how to make peace last, because there was, they'd had a very long period of war and really just wanted to stop interfering in each other's domestic affairs, and also a way of checking each other's ambitions by saying, we will not interfere in your affairs, you will not interfere with our affairs. So essentially each state then had that sovereign power within its territory. And we get this, from there we get this principle of non-interference. I don't interfere in your affairs, you don't interfere in mine. This was really bolstered in the 19th century through nationalism, where states kind of were seen to start to also have a specific language or culture or identity. And we'll talk later on in the course about how nation does not equal a country. It's much more complicated than that, but it was really this idea of Westphalian sovereignty, the idea that, we have a distinct culture, language, identity, and you don't interfere with that. So that's somewhat where we are today, except some argue that, we have more of a post-Westphalian order, in the sense that, yeah, we don't like to interfere with each other's affairs, but at the end of the Cold War, there was this sense that, well, maybe we should be interfering in cases of egregious human rights abuses, when we need to be doing humanitarian intervention. Of course, we know that the responsibility to protect doctrine comes out of that. And so that's kind of where we're at today with this issue of sovereignty, and, is the state sovereign? Is this idea of, yeah, we don't interfere with each other's affairs, but at the same time, sometimes there are reasons why we would need to, and we would interfere with that. So this is the point where I would send you into the little description box to take a look at a video about the Treaty of Westphalia. It's mostly just for a good laugh, so have a look there, kind of pause this, go take a look at that, and then come back. All right, welcome back. So the next term we want to look at is regime, right? So regimes are what we generally would say is the rules and norms of politics. So who has power, who can use it, and who has really the freedom to do what. And a regime is generally the kind of the institutionalized version. So how we talk about like how under the Harper regime or under the Trudeau regime. It's not really what political scientists are getting at when we're talking about regimes. Our regime instead would be kind of like the Canadian democratic institutions that really haven't changed that much. It's generally a regime is what's set out in the Constitution. So I have this picture of the American Constitution there, and it's generally kind of the rules of who gets power and how they can use it. Now, we're going to talk next class about the different types of regimes. So democratic regimes, authoritarian regimes, and different ways that countries or states have decided to organize their power. But it's important to remember that a regime, in political science speak at least, is kind of those rules and norms of politics. Now, what is a government? We often use that term frequently as well, and we would define that as the leadership or the elite who are running the state. So it's less institutionalized. They're going to come and go. The picture I put back here is from 2015 when Trudeau's government came to power. They will eventually leave power. Who knows if it'll be soon or later, but essentially the idea is that it's a little less institutionalized because governments will come and go. Governments are usually some set of elected officials. In authoritarian regimes, it can be unelected officials though, but that's kind of a little less institutionalized. So that's how we get this little diagram here. So this is from the Essentials of Comparative Politics textbook. So essentially we say that the state here, that's the machinery. So that's that whatever organization has the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. So this would be the most institutionalized. That's probably not going to change very quickly, although that being said, of course, we can think of examples where states fall apart pretty darn quickly. But in a case like Canada, for example, we've had a pretty stable state for a very long time. The regime we could understand to be the programming. So the idea, in Canada we have a democratic regime. And even though governments come and go, we stay pretty stably democratic regime. And then the government is kind of the people who are operating this programming. So who are the current operators? And that would be, in this case, Trudeau's government. And again, we say this is less institutionalized because it's going to change very quickly. Every 4 years we have an election and we have this opportunity to change it even quicker if we have a minority government. So this is one of the ways that we might understand the state, a regime, and a government kind of as a triangle in terms of institutionalization and in terms of the state being the machinery, the regime being the programming or how we do it, and then the government being who's the current operators of this state. All right, so the next question we might have is, okay, we keep talking about legitimate use of violence, who's legitimately sovereign. Where does a state get legitimacy then? So why do people allow these arrangements? How did these arrangements come to be? You need to have some sense of political legitimacy in order to maintain domination over your subjects, right? If they decide that you are not legitimate, you're going to be out of power pretty quickly because they can rise up and kind of boost you out. So how do states get this legitimacy? So we're going to talk about two major theories of where this legitimacy comes from. So one is divine legitimacy. It's the idea that goes, back to ancient times, the divine right of kings, that God gives a mandate to a certain king or a certain ruler or a certain family of rulers, and that's where they get their legitimacy. So the monarch then is not subject to kind of an earthly authority or to the people. They derive their right to rule directly from the will of God, and that human beings therefore need to, or the subjects need to obey this particular king because really, that king is under the jurisdiction of God. And we saw this in the pagan world previously where, kings were ruling with the backing of heavenly powers, or maybe they were divine beings themselves. And then this Christian notion of the divine right of kings that we saw, throughout Middle Ages, for example, going all the way back to, kings of Israel, and the idea that, God will give the people a good king and then they can obey them and everything will be happy. Obviously, that's the very short version of that. So that tends not to be commonly today how we would understand where legitimacy comes from, but for a long period of time it was. And then came along this idea of rational or legal authority. And so back to our friend Weber, who we talked about earlier, he saw kind of three ways to get legitimacy. And the first is on traditional ground. So whoever is defending traditions, they're the ones who have a legitimate claim to power. The second, he said, was you could have legitimacy based on charismatic leadership. So everybody was devoted to a leader or to a group that's particularly virtuous, and therefore that's how you get legitimacy. But the third is this rational legal authority. So this idea that legitimacy comes because a certain group has been placed into power in some sort of a legal manner, according to some sort of code of laws that society has decided together is how they're going to choose who is in power. And so if the society as a whole has decided how power is going to be exercised, if they say, hey, here are our laws for choosing who's going to be in power, then this is a legitimate authority. So we'll often call this a social contract, the idea that that the people give power to a particular ruler, and as long as that ruler is abiding by the rules that they've established, then they have that legitimate ability to rule on behalf of the people. And we're going to look specifically at the social contract in some primary texts when we get into the class time. We're going to be looking at some key political thinkers and how they understood this social contract to work and where legitimacy comes from. All right, so question number 3 then is, how did the modern state come to be? And I put the caveat in Europe because, to be quite honest, all of these commentators are speaking about the rise of modern states in Europe. So just a reminder that the state is not the only way that things could be organized, right? We had feudalism, back in the day. There was empires, there's divine rules, there's, mercenary armies. Whoever can pay the most gets to rule. So how did we end up with this system of modern states? So we're going to talk about 3 different political scientists. Each of them have written a book about, how the modern state came to be. So the first one is Charles Tilly. He wrote this book, Coercion, Capital in European States. Published it in 1990. And for him, it's all about the means of coercion. So essentially, again, back during the era of the 30 Years' War and later on, there was this race to fund expensive military technology. And so because of this military competition, there needed to be some sort of way to raise capital in order to buy and use all of these expensive military technologies. It was just kind of a necessity. Otherwise, somebody's going to come and conquer you. So before the sovereign state system, rulers of empires and city-states were able to use personal resources to purchase weapons, and they would just pay their mercenaries to wage war. But with the growing number of wars that were coming out of the Middle Ages and advancements in military technology, it just really became unsustainable. So the rulers needed to seek out kind of new ways to extract resources to fund their wars, to make sure that they could protect themselves, right? Legitimate use of violence. So you need to have the means to do that. And so he explains that there's 2 forms. One was a coercive intensive and one was a capital intensive model of resource extraction. The idea of coercive intensives is that they would squeeze the means of war. These rulers would squeeze these means of war out of their populations. And to do that, though, you need to have some sort of structure to extract what you need from the people. And that's best managed through the infrastructure of a large state. So ultimately, you end up with the state apparatus. Also, the other one was a capital intensive. So the rulers would bargain with early capitalists and say, okay, you can engage in this particular area, but I want to cut of this. And the relationships between the rulers and the capitalists would start to converge on cities. And again, you need to have some sort of an infrastructure, and you have to have a way to leverage this particular capital. So the best states were combining these methods of resource extractions, coercive and capital, into a sovereign state system. And the states started to grow more powerful, and that's what ushered in this era of sovereign states in Europe, because things just got expensive to wage war, and there needed to be a solution, a way to actually go about extracting enough resources from the population, from the people around you, in order to defend yourself and to wage these wars. So for Charles Tilly, how did the state come about? It was all about the means of coercion. So getting access to these expensive military innovations. So Spruitt, I assume that's how you pronounce his name. I actually just realized that mostly I read this name. I don't actually say it out loud. So Spruitt, it's all about economics. It's all about economics and trade. So the rise of trade was really an exogenous shock to the European system. So exogenous means essentially something that came from outside, that all of a sudden we had a lot of trade that was going on. We had the means to trade, and we get the development of large urban centers, which were started to become necessary. So similar to what Charles Tilly said. And these large urban centers were more powerful in trade because of their ability to standardize trading practices within their jurisdictions. So it became advantageous for these city-states then to evolve into territorially defined sovereign states, to encourage the standardization of practice within geographic area and to have very clear and enforceable rules. And so the rise of these new political coalitions then were needed to expand the trade, and this ended up developing into a modern state system in order to encourage this economic development and trade. So for Spruitt, it's all about the economics being needed, and the new political coalitions that come with trade that gave birth to this territorial-based state system. The third theory, actually it should say theory number 3, but that's okay. Daniel Philpott wrote a really good book, Revolutions in Sovereignty. I really encourage you, if you're into this, political theory of the development of states, to take a look at it. I have a copy, so come talk to me. He says it's really all about ideas, particularly this idea of the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation brought major changes to our understanding of power in Europe. So Protestantism had this idea of a separation of power from the papacy, which is pretty much the only thing at that time that all of Protestantism could agree upon. So it changed the ways that Europeans thought of themselves in a political hierarchy. And so the Catholic Church at this particular time held lots of land, they had a lot of political power, they had a lot of power to extract resources, and Protestant Europe realized, okay, so we're not part of that anymore. So it brought about a great amount of pluralism, the idea that, there was no longer this great hierarchy all related to the Catholic Church. We all have this idea of we can each worship how we want, and we can have allegiance to who we want. And so Protestants tried to fill the power void left by the Catholic Church by tying their allegiance to their locality as the major political identity. So political rulers found it useful to solidify their territorial power by saying, okay, so you're not part of the Universal Catholic Church anymore. You are a Finnish Lutheran, or you are a Swede, or you are German, or, well, it wouldn't have quite been German yet, but this idea that that it became tied up in your national identity as opposed to this identity in this one religion. And so from there, Philpott would also demonstrate how the sovereign state system came to be through the 30 Years' War that we talked about, the Peace of Westphalia, and that but the main kind of idea that started it all was this Protestant Reformation, and the idea that we're free now to find our own allegiances and our own choices, and so we will start putting that allegiance into the state rather than into the church. All right, so that's it for today's first lecture. So head on over to the quiz over on the Moodle. It should take you just a few minutes to fill out. It's just a way of checking to make sure that you have actually looked at this. We're going to review this in our first class, and then we're going to look at some primary source texts. And then on Thursday class, we'll dive into some methodology, which I'm really excited about. So head on over to the Moodle and do the quiz, and we'll see you on Tuesday.